My name is Lucy Collins. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in roles that reward steadiness, analysis, planning, quiet follow-through. I'm the kind of person people describe as reliable, sometimes reserved, occasionally hard to read. If you passed me on the street or sat across from me in a meeting, you might assume I'm agreeable, maybe even passive. That assumption followed me for a long time, and for a while, I let it. This story isn't about sudden rebellion or dramatic revenge. It's about something slower and far more common: how control can hide inside protection, and how long it can take to realize the difference. The simplest way to say it is this: my older brother controlled every decision I made, not through shouting or threats, not through obvious cruelty. He did it through concern, advice, and the quiet authority that comes when everyone agrees someone knows best. From the outside, our relationship looked admirable. People saw a responsible older brother and a younger sister who trusted him. They saw stability. They saw family loyalty. What they didn't see were the small permissions I learned to ask for, the choices I stopped considering my own, or the way my confidence thinned without anyone noticing. I'm telling this story now because I've learned that domination doesn't always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in care. When protection turns into domination, it rarely announces itself. It feels reasonable. It feels safe. It feels like love. Until one day, it doesn't. Over the course of this story, I'll walk you through how that dynamic formed, how I participated in it without realizing I had a choice, and how things shifted, not with an argument, but with clarity. There are no villains here in the cartoon sense. There's no public humiliation, no explosive confrontation. What happens instead is quieter: observation, preparation, and decisions made without needing permission. I'm not sharing this to punish anyone or to rewrite the past as something it wasn't. I'm sharing it because honesty matters more to me now than appearing calm at my own expense. If you've ever been the easy one, the grateful one, or the person whose silence was mistaken for consent, parts of this may feel uncomfortably familiar. This is a documentary style account of how I moved from being managed to being self directed. It's about patience, boundaries, and the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. I promise accuracy over drama, reflection over blame, and truth without embellishment. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever looked back at a relationship and wondered when care quietly crossed into control? To most people, I was easy to define because I didn't resist definition. In my family, I was the younger one, even well into my 30s. At work, I was the person who would step in when something needed to be finished quietly and correctly. Among friends, I was the listener, the one who remembered details, the one who didn't need much. Those labels weren't forced on me at first. I accepted them because they felt accurate, even flattering. Reliable, low maintenance, sensible. My older brother was the axis around which those perceptions formed. He was 7 years older than me, confident in a way that made people relax around him. He spoke with certainty, not arrogance. When he offered advice, it sounded like experience, not control. Teachers trusted him. Relatives deferred to him. When our parents worried, they worried less if he was involved. And when I followed his lead, everyone, including me, believed that was simply how things were supposed to work. If someone asked who made decisions in our family, they wouldn't have said his name out loud. They would have said, well, Lucy's brother helps her, or he looks out for her. That language mattered. It framed everything as assistance, never authority. I didn't feel invisible at first, I felt supported. When I chose a university close to home, instead of the one I originally wanted, it felt practical. When I didn't move cities after graduation, it felt responsible. When I ran financial decisions past him before making them, it felt wise. Each choice made sense in isolation. Each one had a reasonable explanation. And because I didn't protest, no one questioned whether I needed to. Over time, something subtle happened. People stopped asking me what I wanted. At family gatherings, questions about my plans were redirected toward him. Do you think that's a good idea for Lucy? Have you talked to your brother about that? Even casual comments carried assumptions. If I hesitated, someone would say, maybe check with him. If I agreed too quickly, it was taken as confirmation that the system worked. And I reinforced it. I smiled. I nodded. I let conversations move past me because interrupting them felt unnecessary. I wasn't unhappy. I wasn't desperate to escape. I just didn't take up space. That absence became part of my identity. What's difficult to explain is that I didn't feel oppressed. I felt efficient. Life ran smoothly when someone else held the map. Decisions were faster when they came pre-approved. Doubt was easier to manage when it could be outsourced. Looking back, I can see how neatly I fit the role I was given: competent but secondary, intelligent but guided, adult but supervised, useful without being autonomous, present without being central. My brother rarely told me what to do outright. He asked questions that narrowed options. He pointed out risks selectively. He reminded me of past mistakes at moments when confidence mattered. Always calm, always concerned, always framed as just trying to help. And I absorbed the message without ever hearing it spoken. Your judgment is good, but mine is safer. Others believed this about me too. Colleagues trusted me with execution, not direction. Friends came to me for support, not leadership. I even described myself that way. I'm better behind the scenes, I would say. I don't need to be in charge. That sentence became a shield. It protected me from conflict, from scrutiny, from having to explain choices that weren't entirely mine. It also protected everyone else from noticing how little room I'd left myself to grow. Invisibility doesn't always feel like erasure. Sometimes it feels like comfort, like being spared responsibility, like being understood without speaking. But comfort has a cost. At the time, I couldn't have named it. I just knew that when decisions came up, big ones, small ones, I instinctively looked outward before looking inward. Approval came first, desire came later, if at all. That was who I was to them. The calm one, the agreeable one, the sister who trusted, the woman who didn't make waves. And for a long time, I believed that was who I truly was. The first moment didn't feel important when it happened. That's what made it effective. It was a conversation about something ordinary: work, timing, logistics. I had been offered a short-term assignment on a different team. Not a promotion, not a dramatic leap, just a lateral move that came with new responsibilities and exposure. I mentioned it casually over dinner, expecting at most a neutral response. My brother paused, just for a second. Then he smiled and said, "Are you sure you're ready for that kind of pressure?" It wasn't the question itself, it was the way it landed. Calm, reasonable, almost protective. Anyone else at the table would have heard concern. I felt something else, a brief, sharp hesitation where confidence had been. I answered quickly. Filling the silence, I explained the structure, the support, and the timeline. I heard myself defending an opportunity I hadn't yet decided to accept. He listened, nodded, and then added, "I just don't want you burning out again like last time." That comment was delivered gently, like a reminder, but it reached back years, to a period when I had been overwhelmed and asked for help. He hadn't misremembered it, he had stored it. No one else reacted. The conversation moved on. Plates were cleared. Someone asked about weekend plans. The moment passed, officially unnoticed. But I noticed. Later that night, alone, I replayed it. Not with anger, but confusion. Why had I felt smaller after a question that sounded reasonable? Why had I needed to justify myself so quickly? I told myself I was being sensitive. He was just looking out for me. That was his role. That was always his role. So I let it go, except I didn't, not entirely. Over the next few days, I found myself reevaluating the assignment through his framing instead of my own. I focused on the risks he'd mentioned, the stress, the possibility of failure. I remembered being tired years ago and treated it as evidence instead of context. By the time I declined the offer, it felt like my idea. That's the part that stayed with me, the quiet efficiency of it. No argument, no command, just a small redirection, barely visible. A cut so clean it didn't bleed. I didn't tell anyone about it because there was nothing to tell. If I tried to explain, it would have sounded petty. He asked if I was ready. He reminded me of burnout. None of that qualified as harm. None of it broke any rules. And yet something had shifted. I started noticing similar moments, always minor, always defensible. When I talked about traveling alone, he'd ask about safety statistics. When I mentioned saving for something personal, he'd suggest more practical uses for the money. When I sounded excited, he'd slow the pace. When I hesitated, he'd step in. Individually, each moment made sense. Together, they formed a pattern I wasn't ready to name. What made it harder was that everyone else trusted him completely. If he had concerns, they were taken seriously. If I adjusted my plans, it was seen as maturity. No one ever said I was being limited. They said I was being sensible. So I questioned myself instead. Maybe I was overestimating my capacity. Maybe caution was wisdom. Maybe autonomy was overrated. I told myself that good decisions didn't need to feel exciting. They just needed to work. Still, there was that feeling, the faint sting that came after certain conversations. Not pain, not anger, just a quiet awareness that I'd been nudged off my own center. The first small cut didn't change my life. It didn't wake me up. It didn't make me confront anything. But it taught me something without using words. It taught me how easy it was for someone else's concern to outrank my own judgment. How quickly I'd learned to defer without being asked. How silence could be shaped. I didn't confront him. I didn't pull away. I didn't even label it as a problem. I just remembered it. And that memory stayed with me, waiting for others like it to give it context. Normalization doesn't happen through repetition alone. It happens through explanation. After that first moment, I became very good at explaining things away, both to myself and to others. Each time my brother redirected me, I supplied the logic before anyone asked for it. I learned to anticipate objections, to soften my own ideas before they were challenged, to present choices that were already filtered through what I knew would be approved. That felt like maturity, like learning how the world worked. When friends talked about taking risks, changing careers, moving cities, ending relationships, I listened carefully, then said things like, "That's exciting, but have you thought about the long-term stability?" The language sounded like mine. It had his rhythm, his caution. I didn't realize I was borrowing a voice until it started answering for me. Disrespect, when it came, was subtle enough to disguise itself as efficiency. If I made a plan without consulting him, he'd ask why I hadn't mentioned it sooner. Not accusatory, curious, as if omission itself was a flaw. If I disagreed with his assessment, he'd pause and say, "You can do what you want, obviously," before explaining why that would be unwise. The phrase, "you can do what you want," became a signal, not permission. Over time, I stopped noticing the pattern consciously. My body noticed first. I felt a slight tension before sharing good news, as if I needed to prepare for revision. I edited enthusiasm out of my voice. I waited for feedback before allowing myself to feel settled. Approval became the final step in decision-making, even when the decision had already been made. And still, no one would have called it disrespect. He never interrupted me. He never raised his voice. He never took credit for my work or spoke over me in public. If anything, he praised my competence, especially when it aligned with his advice. "See, that's exactly what I meant," he'd say, smiling as if we were collaborators. I accepted that framing because it protected my self-image. I wasn't being controlled, I was being guided. I wasn't overlooked, I was supported. The alternative, that my agency was slowly being eroded, felt too dramatic to consider. So I normalized it. I told myself that families have dynamics, that older siblings worry, and that I benefited from his experience. I pointed out the ways my life functioned smoothly. I had a stable job. No major crises, no public failures. Stability became evidence that the system worked. What I didn't account for was what stability was costing me. I started to feel distant from my own preferences. When someone asked what I wanted, my mind went blank for a second longer than it should have. I knew what was sensible. I knew what was expected. Desire felt abstract, like a language I'd once spoken fluently and now translated. In group settings, decisions were often made quickly, and I rarely pushed back. If my suggestion differed from his, he'd rephrase it, adjust it, or gently explain why another option was better. Others nodded. The conversation moved on. I told myself it wasn't worth insisting. That's how respect erodes, not through open dismissal, but through replacement. My voice wasn't silenced, it was edited. The most unsettling part was how complicit I felt. No one forced me to stay quiet. No one threatened me with consequences. I could have insisted. I could have said no. The fact that I didn't make it harder to see myself as someone being wronged. So, instead of asking whether I was being diminished, I asked whether I was being difficult. Each time I swallowed a disagreement, I told myself it was temporary. Each time I deferred, I told myself it was strategic. I believed that one day, when the right moment came, I'd step forward naturally. But moments don't announce themselves when you're trained to step back. Disrespect, once normalized, becomes invisible. It blends into routine. It hides in reasonable language and good intentions. It survives because it doesn't hurt enough to demand action. By the time I recognized the feeling for what it was, A quiet, persistent shrinking, it had already become familiar. And familiarity, I learned, is one of the strongest forms of control. I didn't wake up one day and realize I had a role. I grew into it, gradually, the way a path forms where people walk often enough. The role was never stated outright, but everyone seemed to understand it. I was the one who would adapt, the one who would accommodate, the one whose life could bend without breaking. When plans changed, I adjusted. When priorities conflicted, mine moved. Not because anyone demanded it, because it was expected. At work, I became indispensable in a specific way. I was trusted with implementation, not authorship. I was asked to sanity check decisions rather than make them. When projects succeeded, the credit traveled upward. When something stalled, I was brought in to fix it quietly. My competence was acknowledged, but never allowed to challenge the hierarchy. It mirrored my family life more closely than I wanted to admit. My brother often spoke for me without meaning to. Lucy's fine with that. Lucy doesn't mind. Lucy's flexible. Each statement was accurate enough to pass without correction. I had built a reputation on not objecting, and reputation has momentum. When I did try to assert a preference, it was treated like an exception that needed justification. That's unusual for you, someone would say, smiling, as if wanting something different was a deviation from character, not an expression of it. The most telling part was how useful the role was. To everyone except me, my brother relied on my adaptability to keep family logistics smooth. Others relied on my patience to avoid conflict. At work, my supervisors relied on my restraint to maintain order. I was the stabilizer, the buffer, the person who absorbed friction so others didn't have to. And I was praised for it. You're so easy to work with. You're very grounded. You don't have an ego. Those compliments reinforced the role more effectively than criticism ever could have. They made resistance feel selfish. They framed self-advocacy as unnecessary drama. I started to notice how rarely people checked in with me emotionally. They checked in with me functionally. Can you handle this? Can you take this on? But no one asked whether I wanted to, including me. I had internalized the assignment so completely that I performed it even when no one was watching. I preemptively managed expectations. I limited my own ambitions to avoid disruption. I told myself that leadership didn't suit me, that visibility wasn't important, that my satisfaction came from being useful. That belief was comfortable. It explained why I stayed where I was. It justified the quiet unease I felt when I saw others move forward while I remained steady. My brother reinforced this role without malice. When I talked about change, he'd remind me of what I was good at. You thrive in support roles, he'd say sincerely. Not everyone needs to be out front. What he didn't say, but what I heard, was stay where you are. And because he had always been positioned as the protector, his interpretation of my limits carried more weight than my curiosity about my potential. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity. One evening, after agreeing, again, to adjust my plans to accommodate someone else's needs, I sat alone and felt something unfamiliar. Not frustration, not sadness, a kind of quiet disbelief. I had become reliable by becoming predictable. I had become helpful by becoming smaller. And the role I played so well had no exit built into it. I wasn't trapped by force. I was held in place by expectation, mine included. Understanding that didn't free me immediately. But it changed the way I listened. It changed what I noticed. It changed the weight of my silence. Because once you see the role you've been assigned, you can no longer pretend you chose it freely. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no final straw that snapped in half. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a place I'd been 100 times before. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing notes from a meeting that had ended exactly the way I expected it to. I'd presented an analysis. Someone else had summarized it. The plan moving forward reflected my work, but not my input. I closed my laptop and felt that familiar, low-level resignation settle in. Then my phone vibrated. It was a message from my brother, a suggestion, framed as a reminder. Something small about a financial decision I'd mentioned in passing the week before. He hadn't asked whether I'd decided yet. He'd assumed I hadn't, and proceeded to advise me accordingly. Normally, I would have thanked him and adjusted my plan. Instead, I stared at the screen longer than usual. Not because the advice was wrong. It wasn't. Not because it was intrusive. It had always been that way. What stopped me was a sudden, clear question that surfaced without effort. When did I stop deciding things before explaining them? The question landed quietly, but it didn't leave. I didn't respond to the message right away. That alone felt strange. A mild internal resistance, like skipping a step in a routine. I put the phone down and went back to my notes, but my attention had shifted. I wasn't thinking about the content anymore. I was thinking about the process. I replayed recent decisions in my mind. Not the outcomes, but the order of events. How often had I sought validation before forming an opinion? How often had I edited choices preemptively? How often had I deferred not because I doubted myself, but because I anticipated being questioned? The answers were uncomfortable in their consistency. That afternoon, I took a walk without a destination. No podcast, no phone calls, just the sound of my steps and the space to let thoughts surface without organizing them for anyone else. I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry at my brother. I wasn't even disappointed. What I felt was a kind of grief, not for what he'd done, but for how thoroughly I'd handed over my authority without noticing. There was a memory that kept returning, uninvited. Me, years earlier, making a decision on impulse, trusting it, living with the outcome. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done that. That realization carried weight. The shift wasn't about rebellion. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about ownership. About recognizing that my life had become a collaborative project where I'd slowly relinquished final approval. When I got home, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I wrote. Not a plan, not a list, just observations, patterns, moments that had felt off, but never dramatic enough to name. Seeing them together on the page made them harder to dismiss. What stood out wasn't cruelty, it was consistency. Advice that flowed in one direction, concern that always overruled enthusiasm, support that required compliance, and my response to it all, accommodation. That night, my brother followed up on his earlier message. Just checking in, he wrote. Let me know what you decide. I read it, set the phone down, and went to bed without replying. That was the moment something truly shifted. Not outwardly, but internally. For the first time, silence didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like space. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I wasn't preparing an explanation. I was simply allowing myself to finish a thought before sharing it. That restraint, choosing not to respond immediately, choosing not to justify, felt unfamiliar and steady at the same time. Like standing on ground I hadn't realized was mine. Nothing changed the next day, or the day after. The world didn't react. No one noticed. But I did. And once that awareness settled in, I knew I wouldn't be able to return to the way things were. Not because I was ready to act, but because I had finally stopped outsourcing my sense of direction. The shift was quiet, almost invisible. But it was irreversible. After that day, my silence changed its meaning. Before, silence had been reflexive. It was the pause that followed someone else's certainty, the space where my own opinion dissolved before it fully formed. I stayed quiet because it was easier, smoother, and more efficient. Silence kept things calm. Now it has become deliberate. I didn't announce anything. I didn't explain myself. I simply stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine to fill. When my brother offered advice, I listened without reacting immediately. When people assumed my agreement, I let the assumption sit unanswered a moment longer than usual. At first, it felt like doing nothing. But doing nothing, I learned, can be an action when it interrupts a pattern. The reactions were subtle. A raised eyebrow, a second follow-up question, a "what do you think?" delivered with mild surprise, as if the answer had always been optional but rarely necessary. My silence disrupted the rhythm others had grown comfortable with. They mistook it for uncertainty. My brother, especially, seemed to interpret my restraint as hesitation. He offered more detail, more context, more reassurance. He filled the space I used to occupy, convinced he was helping me think something through. I let him, not because I needed the input, but because I was learning something important: how people behave when you stop managing their expectations. I began noticing how often my quick responses had protected others from discomfort. My silence asked them to sit with it instead. It revealed who needed control, who needed validation, and who simply needed time. At work, I applied the same restraint. When asked for immediate agreement, I said, "I'll get back to you." When plans were presented as final, I asked clarifying questions instead of nodding. Nothing confrontational, nothing dramatic, just enough pause to reclaim presence. Some colleagues assumed I was overwhelmed. Others assumed I was disengaged. No one assumed I was being intentional. That misunderstanding worked in my favor. Silence gave me space to observe without being observed. I listened more than I spoke, not because I lacked opinions, but because I was mapping dynamics: who spoke first, who deferred, who filled silence with authority, who grew uncomfortable when consensus wasn't immediate. With my brother, the shift was gradual. He began checking in more often, asking whether everything was okay. I assured him it was. That was true. I had never felt calmer. What he didn't see was how much work was happening beneath the surface. In the evenings, I reviewed finances I'd once delegated. I reread contracts I'd signed quickly because someone else had looked them over. I noted patterns in communication: what was framed as concern, what was framed as inevitability. None of it felt urgent. That was the point. Urgency had always benefited the person in charge. Calm gave me clarity. There were moments when old instincts resurfaced, when I wanted to explain myself, to reassure, to smooth things over. Each time I asked myself a simple question: is my silence harming anyone, or is it just making them uncomfortable? The answer was always the latter. I wasn't withdrawing, I was recalibrating. People often equate quiet with weakness because they expect power to announce itself. They expect confidence to be loud, decisive, and visible. They underestimate what happens when someone stops performing compliance. My brother continued as before, confident that the system still functioned. He assumed my silence meant trust. He didn't notice that I had stopped asking for permission in my own mind, even if I hadn't yet acted on it externally. That distinction mattered. Silence, chosen consciously, became a filter. It allowed me to separate useful input from habitual control. It showed me which relationships depended on my compliance to remain comfortable. And most importantly, it gave me time to think without interference, time to plan without broadcasting intent, time to let clarity solidify into something steadier. I didn't correct anyone's assumptions. I didn't announce a change. I let them believe what they needed to believe. Because when silence is no longer submission, it becomes leverage, and they never see it coming. While everyone else interpreted my quiet as retreat, something else was happening entirely. Preparation doesn't announce itself. It looks like routine. It blends into habits people have already categorized as harmless. Because I had spent so long being predictable, no one questioned the version of me that stayed late, took notes, and asked careful follow-up questions. They thought I was still maintaining. In reality, I was documenting. I began with small things: timelines, emails, casual comments that revealed assumptions. Not to weaponize them, not to build a case in anger, but to understand the structure I was operating within. Patterns are easier to see when you stop reacting to them emotionally. At work, I noticed how decisions were justified after the fact, how credit was framed, how responsibility traveled downward while authority stayed put. I tracked where information bottlenecked and who controlled access. None of it was shocking. All of it was useful. At home, the process was quieter. I reviewed shared accounts, historical decisions, and agreements I'd once considered informal. I realized how often my brother had positioned himself as an intermediary, not because I couldn't manage things, but because I had allowed him to. Convenience had slowly hardened into dependency. What struck me most was how little resistance I encountered when I stopped asking questions out loud and started answering them privately. No one checked whether I understood the full picture. No one verified my consent beyond habit. They assumed continuity because it had always been there. I let that assumption stand. Instead of seeking clarity through conversation, I sought it through learning. I improved my financial literacy. I consulted professionals quietly: accountants, advisors, without framing it as a problem that needed fixing. I read contracts the way I used to read novels, line by line, alert to subtext. Each piece of information did something important. It returned authorship to me. I wasn't plotting. I wasn't anticipating confrontation. I was assembling context, understanding how things actually worked rather than how they were explained to me. My brother never noticed the shift because nothing about my behavior triggered alarm. I was still polite, still responsive, still fine. I didn't challenge his input, I simply stopped relying on it. That distinction mattered. People who are used to being deferred to don't notice when they stop being decisive. They notice resistance. They notice refusal. They rarely notice independence until it changes outcomes. I also paid attention to my own reactions. The old anxiety, fear of making the wrong choice, fear of disappointing someone, began to fade as competence replaced compliance. Confidence grew not from affirmation, but from evidence. I tested myself in low-risk ways. making small decisions without consulting anyone, letting them stand, observing the results. Nothing collapsed, nothing broke. The world remained stable. That realization was grounding. The most important thing I documented wasn't external, it was internal shifts, moments when I would have once explained myself and didn't, moments when I felt the urge to defer and chose not to. Each one reinforced a new baseline. Silence paired with preparation changed my posture. I didn't announce boundaries. I built them quietly through knowledge and readiness. I positioned myself so that when decisions eventually needed to be made, I wouldn't need approval, I would need timing. And timing depends on patience. What they never noticed was how much power comes from being underestimated, from being seen as passive, agreeable, and unchanged. My history worked as camouflage. While they assumed I was maintaining equilibrium, I was redefining it. By the time anyone sensed something different, the groundwork would already be laid. Not dramatically, not visibly, but thoroughly. Preparation, I learned, isn't about anticipation of conflict. It's about ensuring that when clarity demands action, you don't hesitate. And I was getting close to that point. The reveal didn't arrive with excitement. There was no rush, no sense of victory. It arrived quietly, on a Tuesday evening, in the form of understanding. I had been reviewing documents, old ones, the kind that had accumulated over the years and never demanded attention because someone else had always summarized them for me. Shared financial decisions, informal agreements, choices made for convenience. I wasn't looking for proof of wrongdoing. I was looking for coherence. What I found instead was leverage. Not in the dramatic sense, in the structural one. I realized how many decisions had been made in my name but without my direct involvement. How many permissions had been assumed rather than confirmed. How many systems relied on my passivity to remain uncomplicated. Nothing illegal, nothing malicious, just a web of arrangements that functioned smoothly because I didn't interfere. And I could interfere, legally, calmly, decisively, simply by stepping fully into my role as an equal participant. That understanding settled in slowly. My brother had positioned himself as the coordinator, the translator, the protector. In doing so, he had also taken on a responsibility he never questioned because it had never been challenged. Authority, I realized, often exists by default, not design. The private reveal wasn't about discovering a secret he'd hidden. It was about recognizing a permission I had granted without realizing it could be withdrawn. I sat with that knowledge longer than expected. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to be precise. Power used prematurely becomes noise. Power used quietly becomes an outcome. I asked myself difficult questions. What did I actually want to change? What mattered? And what was simply habit? Where did autonomy need to be reclaimed? And where was collaboration still welcome? This wasn't about reversal, it was about correction. The clarity that came with the reveal was almost clinical. Emotional, yes, but not reactive. I felt no urge to confront him immediately, no desire to expose anything. The situation didn't require drama, it required alignment. I began to see the future more clearly, not in detail, but in direction. What would happen if I stopped allowing assumptions to stand? What would shift if I insisted on direct communication? What would change if decisions that affected me required my explicit consent? The answers were obvious once I allowed myself to ask. There was also a sobering realization. The leverage I'd uncovered wasn't something I could use against him without becoming someone I didn't want to be. That mattered to me. My moral code had survived this process intact, and I intended to keep it that way. The leverage wasn't a weapon, it was insulation. It meant I no longer needed to negotiate from a position of dependency. It meant I could make choices without fear of destabilizing my own life. It meant that when change came, it would be sustainable. I slept well that night. The next morning, nothing looked different. My brother messaged me about something routine. I responded normally. At work, meetings unfolded as usual. On the surface, the system remained intact. Internally, everything had shifted. Knowing where authority actually lived and where it only appeared to changed how I moved through conversations. I was no longer seeking reassurance. I was assessing alignment. The private reveal gave me something I'd never had before: certainty that I could act without permission and without chaos. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph, just a quiet steadiness that replaced years of low-grade doubt. I understood finally that the control I'd experienced wasn't absolute. It had never been. It relied on my participation. And participation, unlike love or loyalty, is always a choice. Clarity eventually demands a decision, not immediately, but inevitably. For a while after the private reveal, I existed in a kind of suspended awareness. I knew what I could do. I knew what I no longer needed to tolerate. But knowing isn't the same as choosing. And choice, I learned, carries weight even when exercised quietly. I gave myself time to consider every option without urgency. I could continue as before, simply more aware. That option was tempting. Awareness alone had already given me a sense of internal freedom. I could maintain peace, preserve familiarity, and avoid discomfort. Nothing would break. Nothing would change. I could confront my brother directly, lay everything out, explain how his protection had crossed into control, ask him to adjust. That option appealed to my sense of fairness, but it came with risks, not of anger, but of negotiation, of being pulled back into explanation, justification, and compromise, of having my clarity diluted by discussion before it had time to harden into action. Or I could do something else entirely. I could change the structure without changing the tone. That third option was the one I returned to repeatedly. It wasn't passive. It wasn't aggressive. It was definitive. I realized that what I needed wasn't permission or acknowledgement. It was separation. Clean, legal, unemotional separation of authority. A way to ensure that future decisions didn't require correction because they would no longer be routed through the same channels. This wasn't about punishing my brother. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about making the old dynamic obsolete. That's what made the decision irreversible. Once systems change, explanations become optional. I weighed the cost carefully. There would be confusion, possibly hurt, almost certainly discomfort. But there would also be alignment between my values, my actions, and my sense of self. I had lived too long without that alignment to ignore its importance now. The question that finally settled it was simple. If nothing else changed, could I respect myself in 5 years? The answer came without hesitation. No. So I chose the path that required the least future negotiation. I didn't announce the decision. I didn't frame it as a turning point. I simply began preparing to implement it, step by step, with intention. This was the moment where silence stopped being observational and became directional. I accepted that some relationships only function when one person stays small. I accepted that stepping out of that role might be interpreted as betrayal, ingratitude, or distance. I accepted that being misunderstood was preferable to being managed. The decision wasn't emotional, but it was deeply personal. It wasn't about winning, it was about ending a pattern that no longer reflected who I was. Once made, the decision brought relief, not excitement, relief, the kind that comes when mental loops finally close. I stopped revisiting alternatives. I stopped second guessing. The energy I'd spent managing the possibility of change was freed to support the reality of it. From that point on, everything I did had direction, even if it looked unchanged from the outside. The decision point didn't involve confrontation or closure. It involved commitment to myself, quietly, without witnesses. And once that commitment was made, there was no going back. Because the most irreversible decisions aren't the loud ones. They're the ones you stop debating. Once the decision was made, movement became practical. Not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. I didn't change my tone or my demeanor. That continuity mattered. Sudden shifts invite scrutiny, and scrutiny invites interference. Instead, I focused on structure, on making quiet adjustments that would reroute authority without announcing it. The first steps were administrative: accounts, permissions, access. Things that had once been shared out of convenience were redefined with clarity. I ensured that anything bearing my name required my direct involvement. Nothing hostile, nothing secret, just precise. I consulted professionals where necessary, always framing my questions as routine. People respond differently when you don't sound uncertain. The more grounded I became, the less explanation I needed. At work, I stopped volunteering to absorb friction that wasn't mine. I documented my contributions clearly. I asked for confirmation in writing, not as a challenge, but as a standard. When responsibilities expanded, I clarified authority alongside them. These actions didn't attract attention because they were reasonable. They aligned with best practices. No one could object without revealing assumptions they preferred to keep unspoken. With my brother, the changes were invisible at first. I still responded to messages, still engaged in conversation, still thanked him for the input when it was offered. The difference was what happened afterward. I no longer adjusted my decisions to match his expectations. I no longer revised plans preemptively. I allowed divergence without explanation. He noticed the outcomes before he noticed the process. "Did you already take care of that?" he asked once, surprised. "Yes," I said, and left it there. Each small instance reinforced the new structure. My independence wasn't declared, it was demonstrated. I also prepared for emotional consequences, even though I didn't dramatize them. I understood that when control is rooted in care, its loss can feel like rejection. I didn't want to escalate that feeling. My goal wasn't distance, it was autonomy. So I stayed calm, neutral, present. The work happened quietly, in moments no one associates with transformation. Reading fine print, updating records, establishing direct communication where intermediaries once existed. I didn't rush because urgency would have betrayed intention. I moved at a pace that felt boring to anyone watching. Boring is safe. Internally, the effect was anything but dull. Each completed step returned a piece of authority I hadn't realized I was missing. Not in a rush, but in a sequence that built stability rather than shock. I learned something important during this phase. Silence without movement is stagnation. Silence paired with action is a strategy. My brother continued offering advice, unaware that its influence had already diminished. He assumed continuity because I hadn't contradicted him. He didn't realize that compliance and consideration are not the same thing. I also noticed how little pushback I encountered overall. Most systems don't resist change when it's framed as maintenance. They resist confrontation, not clarity. By the time anyone sensed that something was different, the changes were already normalized. Authority had shifted hands not through struggle, but through process. Moving in silence wasn't about secrecy, it was about timing, about allowing outcomes to speak before intentions could be questioned. And once outcomes change, explanations lose their power. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They surfaced gradually, like pressure changes that people feel before they understand the cause. At first, it showed up as confusion. My brother began asking questions that hadn't been necessary before, not accusatory. Curious, he wanted updates on things that no longer required his involvement. When I answered briefly, without elaboration, he assumed I was busy, or distracted, or stressed. Others noticed it too, in small ways. At work, someone asked whether I'd changed teams. Another wondered if I was planning something new. These weren't confrontations, they were adjustments, people recalibrating their expectations based on outcomes they couldn't quite explain. The key difference was that the discomfort no longer belonged to me. In the past, any disruption to the familiar would have triggered my instinct to smooth things over. Now I let the questions exist without resolving them for anyone else. My brother felt the shift most clearly when decisions no longer passed through him by default. Plans moved forward without his input. Information reached him after the fact, not before. Not as exclusion, as completion. That reversal unsettled him. He began offering help more frequently, framing it as concern. "You don't have to handle everything on your own," he said once. The irony wasn't lost on me. I responded evenly, "I know," and I meant it. What he was experiencing wasn't loss of connection. It was loss of centrality. He was still involved, still respected, still welcome. He just wasn't necessary. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Consequences also appeared in tone. Conversations slowed, pauses lengthened. Where there had once been confident direction, there was now checking. Where there had been an assumption, there was uncertainty. People don't always react to change with anger. Sometimes they react with disorientation. I watched carefully, not to manage reactions, but to understand them. I wanted to know which relationships were flexible enough to adjust and which depended on old hierarchies to feel stable. Some colleagues adapted easily. They began addressing me directly, aligning communication with the new reality. Others hesitated, unsure whether my authority was permanent or temporary. That uncertainty resolved itself through consistency. I didn't over-explain. I didn't retreat. I simply continued. With my brother, the process was slower. He began reminiscing more, referencing times when I'd relied on him heavily, not manipulatively, nostalgically, as if returning to those moments might reestablish the pattern. I listened without correcting the narrative. There were moments when he seemed almost anxious, though he never named it that way. He asked whether everything was okay between us. I told him it was. That too was true. The relationship wasn't deteriorating, it was recalibrating. And recalibration feels like a loss to the person who once set the scale. What struck me most was how little explanation anyone demanded. People sensed change through outcomes. not declarations. They adjusted because they had to, not because they understood. The consequences weren't dramatic. They were logistical, emotional, and relational, the kind that don't make noise but still require adaptation. I had expected resistance. What I encountered instead was exposure of how much the old system had relied on my compliance to function smoothly. Once that compliance was gone, others had to feel the weight of their own expectations. For the first time, the discomfort of transition belonged to them, not me. And that told me I had chosen correctly. There's a moment in every long-standing dynamic when the person who benefited from it realizes something has changed. And that realization arrives too late for gentle correction. That moment didn't come as anger. It came as an urgency. My brother started reaching out more often, not with advice, but with check-ins that carried an unfamiliar edge. He asked how I was doing, whether I was overwhelmed, and whether I needed support. The words were kind. The timing was revealing. He sensed distance, not in affection, but in access. When I responded calmly and without defensiveness, it seemed to unsettle him more. He offered solutions to problems I hadn't described. He suggested we sync up like we used to. The phrase itself was telling, sync, as if our lives had once run on the same system clock. I agreed to talk, but not urgently, not reactively. That delay changed the balance more than any argument could have. By the time we sat down together, the old mechanisms were already outdated. Decisions had been made, processes updated, independence was established not as a statement, but as a fact. He spoke carefully at first, testing for familiar responses. I just want to make sure you're not carrying too much, he said. You've always had a tendency to take everything on yourself. I listened. Then I said evenly, I'm managing well. He nodded, but didn't relax. He tried another angle, reminding me of times I'd leaned on him, of choices we'd made together. The word together surfaced repeatedly, as if repetition might restore it to its previous meaning. What he didn't understand yet was that togetherness hadn't been removed. It had been redefined. He finally asked the question that mattered. Why didn't you tell me you were changing things? The answer came easily, without rehearsing. Because I wasn't changing us. I was changing how I make decisions. That was the point where urgency turned into realization. He sat back, processing. I could see him searching for a way to respond that would reassert influence without appearing controlling. It's difficult to reclaim authority once it's no longer required. He wasn't angry. He was disoriented. That disorientation is what makes it too late. He suggested adjustments, compromises that would have felt reasonable months earlier, shared oversight, regular check-ins, collaborative planning. Each offer assumed that the old structure could be repaired with negotiation. But structures don't revert once they've been replaced. I didn't reject him. I didn't criticize the past. I simply didn't reopen doors I had already closed. I'm comfortable with how things are now, I said, and meant it. There was no argument because there was nothing to debate. My independence wasn't theoretical. It was operational. The realization settled slowly across his face. He wasn't losing me. He was losing authority he'd assumed was permanent. And authority, once it relies on consent, can't survive its withdrawal. He tried once more, softer this time. I was just trying to help. I know, I said, and that was true. Understanding didn't undo the impact. Care didn't justify control, and intention couldn't override autonomy. By the end of the conversation, the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Not because of anything I said, but because of what I no longer needed. He left with the sense that something had ended. Not a relationship, but a role. And roles once outgrown don't offer second chances. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply too late to fix what no longer needed fixing. If you can call it a confrontation, it was the calmest one I've ever experienced. There was no raised voice, no catalog of grievances, no demand for an apology. What happened between us unfolded slowly, almost quietly, as if both of us understood that intensity would only obscure the truth. We met again a few weeks later, not because either of us insisted, but because it felt unfinished not to. This time, there was no urgency in him, only caution. He approached the conversation the way someone approaches unfamiliar terrain, aware that old instincts might no longer apply. He spoke first. I'm trying to understand where I fit now, he said. That sentence told me everything. It wasn't about my choices. It wasn't about concern. It was about position. I didn't rush to reassure him. You fit where you always did, I said, as my brother, not as my proxy. The words landed without sharpness. I wasn't accusing him of overreach, I was defining a boundary that no longer needed justification. He asked whether he'd crossed a line. I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to be precise. I think the line moved gradually, I said, and neither of us noticed. I didn't stop it early enough. You didn't realize you were stepping over it. That shared responsibility mattered to me. I wasn't interested in rewriting him as a villain. I was interested in accuracy. He listened more than he spoke after that. When he did respond, it was carefully. He explained how responsibility had settled on him naturally, how he'd assumed leadership because no one objected, how protecting me had become part of his identity. I didn't think you needed more space, he said quietly. You always seemed comfortable. That was the closest he came to the truth. I was comfortable being taken care of, I replied. I just didn't realize what it was costing me. There was no denial, no defensiveness, just a long pause where that idea had room to exist. The confrontation, such as it was, didn't aim to resolve everything. It clarified one thing. The old dynamic would not be restored, even partially. We talked about the future in practical terms. What involvement looked like now. What decisions were mine alone. What collaboration would require. Explicit consent, not assumption. He asked whether I still wanted his advice. Sometimes, I said, when I ask for it. That distinction mattered more than tone ever could. The conversation ended without closure in the cinematic sense. There was no emotional release, no sudden warmth, but there was mutual recognition of a new reality. When we stood to leave, nothing felt strained, just different. I realized then that confrontation doesn't need heat to be effective. It needs clarity. It needs calm. It needs a refusal to be pulled back into familiar roles for the sake of comfort. What changed wasn't how we spoke to each other. It was what we no longer assumed. And that, I learned, is where real boundaries live. The person I am now doesn't look dramatically different from the person I was before. That's what surprises people the most. I didn't become louder. I didn't reinvent my personality. I didn't trade patience for dominance or caution for impulsiveness. From the outside, I'm still calm, still measured, still someone who thinks before speaking. The difference is internal and structural. I no longer experience decisions as something that needs to be validated after the fact. I make them with the understanding that I will live with their consequences, and that responsibility belongs to me alone. That sense of ownership has changed how I move through the world more than any external achievement ever could. At work, I occupy space without apologizing for it. I don't announce authority, I exercise it where appropriate. I ask for what I need without explaining why I deserve it. When I disagree, I do so without softening my position to preserve comfort. Not because I'm trying to assert power, but because clarity requires it. With my family, the dynamic has settled into something quieter and more honest. My brother still cares deeply. That never left. What was left was the assumption that care requires control. We speak as adults now, not as guardian and dependent. There are moments of adjustment. Habits don't disappear overnight. But the difference is that when old patterns surface, they don't take root. I notice them. I respond differently. That awareness keeps the balance intact. What I value most now is alignment. My actions match my values. My silence is intentional. My cooperation is chosen, not assumed. When I say yes, it carries weight. When I say no, it doesn't require explanation. I've learned that strength doesn't always announce itself through resistance. Sometimes it reveals itself through refusal. Refusal to perform roles you've outgrown. Refusal to manage other people's expectations at the expense of your own agency. I don't feel bitterness toward my past self. She did what made sense with the information she had. She survived by being agreeable, adaptable, and reliable. Those qualities weren't weaknesses. They just needed boundaries. And I don't resent my brother. He acted within a system that rewarded him for stepping in and never asked him to step back. I participated in that system longer than I should have. Ownership goes both ways. What matters is that I stepped out when I was ready, and that I did it without becoming someone I don't recognize. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others, it's about control over oneself, over timing, over response. I'm still underestimated by people who equate composure with passivity. That no longer concerns me. Underestimation is no longer a vulnerability. It's a condition I understand how to work within. Who I am now is someone who chooses carefully, speaks deliberately, and moves without needing permission. And that finally feels like enough. If there's a single lesson I carry forward from all of this, It's not about family or siblings or even control. It's about how quietly we can disappear from our own lives when we mistake protection for guidance and guidance for authority. No one in this story set out to dominate. No one needed to be exposed or defeated. What happened instead was far more common and far more instructive. A dynamic formed where one person's certainty slowly replaced another person's agency. And because it was framed as care, it went unquestioned for years. That's the danger. When protection turns into domination, it rarely feels abusive. It feels efficient. It feels loving. It feels like relief. And by the time it starts to feel small, you've already adapted to the shape you were given. What changed everything for me wasn't confrontation. It wasn't anger. It was ownership. Ownership of my time. Ownership of my decisions. Ownership of the consequences. Quiet dominance, as I understand it now, isn't about flipping the hierarchy. It's about ending the need for one. It's about making yourself structurally independent enough that no one has to be pushed away, because no one is standing in your place anymore. I didn't reclaim my life by proving anyone wrong. I reclaimed it by no longer needing approval to be right for myself. And maybe the most important part is this: you don't have to villainize someone to outgrow their influence. People can love you and still limit you. People can help you and still control outcomes. People can mean well and still take up too much space in your decision making. Recognizing that doesn't make you ungrateful, it makes you honest. If you're listening to this and feeling unsettled, I want you to know that feeling doesn't mean something is wrong. It might mean something is becoming clear. You don't need to act immediately. You don't need to confront anyone tomorrow. Awareness is already movement. Sometimes the most powerful change begins the moment you stop explaining yourself. I'm sharing this not as a warning, but as an invitation to look closely at where your choices come from and who gets the final say. So I'll leave you with this question, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized, quietly, without drama, that someone else had been making decisions you thought were your own?